Now these are the generations of Terah. Terah fathered Abraham, Nahor, and Haran fathered Lot. Haran died in the presence of his father Terah in the land of his kindred in Ur of the Chaldeans. And Abram and Nahor took wives. The name of Abram's wife was Sarai, and the name of Nahor's wife Milcah. She was the daughter of Haran, the father of Milcah and Iscah. Now Sarai was barren. She had no child. Terah took Abram his son, and Lot the son of Haran his grandson, and Sarai his daughter-in-law, his son Abram's wife. And they went forth together from Ur of the Chaldeans to go into the land of Canaan. But when they came to Haran, they settled there. The days of Terah were 205 years, and Terah died in Haran. Now the Lord said to Abram, "Go from your country and your kindred and your father's house to the land that I will show you. And I will make of you a great nation, and I will bless you and make your name great, so that you will be a blessing. I will bless those who bless you, and him who dishonors you I will curse, and in you all the families of the earth shall be blessed." So Abram went as the Lord had told him, and Lot went with him. Abram was 75 years old when he departed from Haran. And Abram took Sarai his wife, and Lot his brother's son, and all their possessions that they had gathered, and the people that they had acquired in Haran, and they set out to go to the land of Canaan. When they came to the land of Canaan, Abram passed through the land to the place at Shechem, to the oak of Moreh. And at that time the Canaanites were in the land. Then the Lord appeared to Abram and said, "To your offspring I will give this land." So he built there an altar to the Lord who had appeared to him. From there he moved to the hill country on the east of Bethel and pitched his tent, with Bethel on the west and Ai on the east. And there he built an altar to the Lord and called upon the name of the Lord. And Abram journeyed on, still going toward the Negeb. Friends, this is the word of the Lord.
Thanks be to God.
You may be seated. Now, this morning we're beginning a new series of messages looking at the life of Abraham in the book of Genesis. And Abraham is one of the central figures of the Bible. And historically speaking, he's one of the most consequential people who's ever lived. If you look at the three major monotheistic religions, Christianity, Judaism, Islam, the majority of the world's populations all look to Abraham as the father of their faith. And so in other words, if you are wanting to understand human civilization, that undertaking is going to necessarily involve getting to know Abraham. Abraham is one of history's greatest figures, and the question is why, and how did he do it, and why are we still talking about Abraham some 4,000 years after he lived? What's the deal with Abraham? How did he become so great? And the answer that I want to give briefly, and that we'll unpack over this season of Epiphany together, is that the secret to Abraham's greatness can be summarized in one word: grace. The secret of Abraham's greatness is the grace of God. And as we'll see, there's nothing spectacular about Abraham or his ability or his character. In fact, we won't even get out of chapter 12 of Genesis, the beginning of Abraham's origin story, without him falling flat on his face. But what set Abraham apart was the grace of God, that God came to him and invited him into something, that he offered to sweep Abram's story up into his story, and he invited him into something incredibly difficult, but through it, he was able to bless the entire world. And the passage that we read just now is the beginning of Abraham's story. It's like the origin story, that you remember like 10 years ago when Marvel movies were good, and you would go to the theater and you would watch the origin story of Iron Man and Thor and all these people. This is Abraham's origin story. And I've been saying Abraham, and just notice that the text says Abram. Abram means mighty father, and Abraham means father of many. And God actually changes Abram's name about midstream in the story from Abram to Abraham. So if you hear me kind of move between those two names, just know I'm talking about the same person. It's not too much to worry about. But as we look at Abram's origin story this morning, I want us to observe and consider four things, really three things and then one application. And don't worry if you just heard that and think, Matt's New Year's resolution is to preach longer. Don't worry, I'm not going to preach longer. But we're together going to consider four things. We're going to look at first, what does God call Abram to do? Second, what does God give to Abram? Thirdly, how does Abram respond? And then fourthly, how can we do the same? So in other words, we're going to look at the call, the gift, his response, and then our response. All right, so first, let's consider the call. What does God call Abram to do? And we see this right at the very beginning of chapter 12 and verse 1. We read that the Lord said to Abram, "Go from your country and your kindred and your father's house to the land that I will show you." All right, God says, "Go." He comes to Abram, who's living in the city of Haran, in the larger area of think of the Fertile Crescent area of the Middle East, modern day Iraq. God comes to Abram and says, "Go and leave everything behind, your home, your extended family, your immediate family, your father's house, all of it, and go to the place that I'll tell you. I'll tell you to stop when you get there." And as modern people, we read this verse, we may not think too much about it, right? Like God's telling Abram to move cities, to pack up one place and go to another. And many of us have been in that boat. Most of us have not grown up in Madison, so it's not a big deal for us to move from one place to go to another place. And maybe while there's some weird, some eccentric parts about moving to a new place, like you move to Wisconsin and you have long nights, cold days, Wisconsin nice, that kind of stuff. There's still a lot of things that are very familiar, like we speak the same language, there's a McDonald's, stuff like that. And but when it comes to understanding, migration in the ancient world, one of the things you need to pick up on is that it was very rare. It wasn't normal for people in the ancient world to pick up everything and go from one place to another place. The ancient world was a much less safe place than it is today, and so moving from one place to another meant that you were subjected to marauders, to wild animals. It was a very lawless place outside of the walled cities of the ancient world, and so there was a lot of risk involved for moving from one place to another place. It was also a very risky situation because not only was there the language barrier that many of us experience in moving to a new place or a new country, but there's also a religious barrier as well. A lot of the cities of the ancient world coalesced more or less around the same god or the same pantheon of gods that they worshipped. And so we read about the city of Haran, and historians in the ancient world have identified that Haran was more or less set up around a moon god, a moon deity. In fact, Abraham's father's name, Terah, is actually the Hebrew word for moon. So you think that Abraham's dad was a worshiper of this moon idol, and so he settled his family in the city around all the other moon worshipers of the area. In fact, if you go to the book of Joshua, you'll find that it's more likely than not that Abraham was a worshiper of this god as well. Joshua, in Joshua 24, says that when God came to Abraham and his family, they were worshiping foreign gods. And so for God to come to Abraham and say, uproot your life and go someplace new, he's not just calling Abraham to leave his city, his family. He's also calling him to leave his faith, his religion, to shed those identities and to embrace something new that God is calling him into. And that's an incredibly risky thing. It's an incredibly vulnerable thing to do, to shed all those things that you have built up over the course of your life that you feel safe, feels familiar, and to do something unfamiliar and unknown. And so in calling Abram to leave Haran and to go someplace else, God's calling Abram to a particular kind of vulnerability. And God calls him to become uniquely vulnerable so that he can be a blessing to others. And, what would make Abram want to obey such a call? What would give Abram the confidence or the courage to leave all that was known and familiar to him into something new? Because I think he would do that, secondly, because of the gift, of the thing that God gave to Abram. And what was that gift? In a word, it's a promise. God gave Abram a promise. In verses 2-3, God says this. He says, "I will make of you a great nation, and I will bless you and make your name great, so that you will be a blessing. I will bless those who bless you, and him who dishonors you I will curse, and in you all the families of the earth will be blessed." Did you pick up on that? 5 times in 2 verses, God says, I promise I'm going to bless you. I'm going to bless you. God doesn't give Abram directions. He doesn't give him a timeline. Instead, God gives Abram a promise, and that promise has 2 components to it. The first part of that promise is the promise of a people, right? The promise of a child. God says that from him is going to come a nation, a group of people who can all trace their lineage back to him. But secondly, not only is Abram promised a people, He's also, secondly, promised a place. He's promised a land. We get to verse 6 and 7 of our passage here. God comes to Abraham as he's journeying through the land of Canaan. God says to Abram, it's this land. This is the place that I'm going to give you and your offspring. Now, what's the problem with these two components of the promise, the people and the place? It's that they're both completely impossible, right? Not just difficult, not just very, very hard. It's impossible. Look at the first promise, the promise of a people of offspring. In chapter 11, we're introduced to Abram and Sarah. And when we come to Sarah, what's the very first thing we learn about her? In verse 30, we read that Sarai was barren. And then what's the second thing we learn about her? Semicolon, she had no child. So the author of Genesis wants to underscore, he wants to emphasize the fact that this promise of a child is impossible because Abram and Sarai biologically cannot conceive a child on their own. And it's not just that Sarai was barren. We read that Abram was 75 years old when God called him. The book of Hebrews puts it a little bit less nicely. The author of Hebrews in chapter 11 says that Abram was as good as dead, which is very shots fired from the New Testament to Abraham. But it wasn't like Sarah and Abraham were in the position to have a child. It was completely impossible from their perspective. But it wasn't just the promise of a people that's impossible. The promise of land is equally impossible as well. Again, you're just two people against the world moving into this land that already has cities, that already has populations, that already has fortresses and armies and things like that. And who are the people in this land? Verse 6 tells us it's the Canaanites. It's the biggest, baddest brood of giants that the land could produce. The kind of people that when Israel came out of Egypt to scope out the promised land, it filled them with fear and terror because of how big and how menacing and how armed to the teeth they were. And so for Abraham to come into this land of Canaan to possess it would take nothing short of a miracle. And so both components of this promise that God gave, the promise of a people, the promise of a place, could only come about through divine intervention. It could only come about through miraculous conception of a child, through miraculous entry into the land. So God calls Abraham to this impossible task. He gives him a promise. And then thirdly, how does Abram respond? I was struck by the simplicity of the text as I was studying this week. You know how Abram responds? Verse 1, God says to Abram, go. And then verse 4, Abram went. God said go, and Abram went. He didn't ask a question. He didn't ask why. He didn't push back. God said go, and Abram said, yep, all right, let's do it. Now, why on earth would Abraham do such a thing? I think the answer is that at the very core, at the very foundation, Abraham did what he did. He went because God said go, because Abraham was the recipient of divine grace. He had an encounter with the living God who came to him, not to judge him or destroy him, although it could have been his right? Because Abraham and his family were worshiping foreign gods, turning away from the one true God. But God came to Abraham and showed him grace. And not only did God show him grace, he gave him a promise that he was going to make his name great, and that through him all the nations of the earth were going to be blessed. And Abraham must have seen that encounter with God and said, I still have 1,000 questions that I want to ask you. Like, on the one thing, where am I going? How will I know when I get there? How will I know that you make good on your promise? He must have had 1,000 questions, but he must have been so overwhelmed and so apprehended by this encounter with the living God, the experience of encountering mercy when he should have encountered judgment, and said, although I still have 1,000 questions, you are the kind of God I want to follow. You are the kind of God that I want to venture into the unknown with. That although I don't know what lies ahead, Abram says, I'm going to do the next healthy thing and trust this God. And so Abram had an encounter with the God of grace. And so he did the next healthy thing, which was to go, even though he didn't have all the details. He had God's promise, and that was enough for him. And now finally, friends, what does that story have to do with us? Like, what does the calling of Abraham have to say to our lives and the various callings that we have and inhabit? And, for one thing, I want to say that I think the call of Abraham here can resonate and overlap with our stories a lot more than what we realize. For one thing, Did you know that God has called you to something this morning? God has called you to something this morning. Now, what is that thing? On the one hand, I have no idea. What has God called you to? On the one hand, I have no clue, because our lives, our experiences, our stories are so unique and different that there's a million different applications at this point. So for some of you, like Abraham, God is calling you to go this morning. God's calling you to move to a new place, a new city, take a new career, explore a new opportunity. For others, he's calling you to stay. Maybe you came to move to Madison for work or for to get your education. But maybe God is calling you to stay after you graduate college, after you get to the point where you can sabbatical. He's calling you to plant roots here and invest because he's calling you into something unknown and unfamiliar. Or maybe in your marriage, he could be calling you to deeper honesty and intimacy. Or in your singleness, he could be calling you into greater service and communion with him. Like, what is God calling you to this morning? On the one hand, I have no idea. That's between you and the Lord. But on the other hand, I do know something that God has called you to. In spite of all the million unique ways he's calling and wooing each of us in our own stories, we all have a call from God that we need to hear and obey this morning. And that's simply the call to trust him. Regardless of what you feel God calling you to this morning, all of us at bottom, at our very foundation, have a call to trust God, to take him at his word, to believe that he is good, he is gracious, he is merciful, he's in control. The calling that he's calling you to is almost certainly hard, right? It's almost certainly difficult because it means you'll have to be vulnerable to accept it. It means you have to let go of some of the things that you think you're in control of in order to follow God. Not just in the million little callings and decisions that each of us have, but in the most fundamental and core decisions of things that God's calling us to. All of us have the fundamental call to trust the Lord, to believe in whether you're a Christian or or non-Christian this morning. You have a call that God has come to you this morning, and now the call for you is, do you trust him? And at the very foundation, that's the question, isn't it? Who do you trust? Do you trust your own abilities and efforts to make things happen? Do you trust that life will just magically fall into place for you? Do you trust your own ability to recover from bad decisions or from unfortunate circumstances? Or do you want to trust the Lord this morning, who has underwritten reality with his promise, that he is in control of all things and all people, that he is sovereign and he's working even now all things together for the good of those who love him and are called according to his purpose? That even now God is working together all things for his glory and for your good. Friends, regardless of where you are on your journey of faith this morning, God is calling you to trust him this morning. And so the question is, do you? Do you trust him? Will you trust him? But know also that God isn't just calling you to trust him blindly. He's also given you a promise. And even more than that, we have something better than what God gave to Abraham back in Genesis 12. Because we have that promise that became a person. We have the promise that became a person in Jesus. The person that God said that in you all the families of the earth will be blessed, it's through Jesus that promise is fulfilled. And it's in Jesus that we know that God has given us a promise to be with us wherever he has called us to go. And if you're here this morning and you're wondering whether God can be trusted, you don't just have to look at God's promises. You can look at God's person. You can look at Jesus. Look at Jesus. You see, Jesus also had a call on his life as well. He was called to get out. He was called to leave his Father's house. He left the ultimate Father's house, right? Talk about the security. He had the ultimate security, and he left that security. He became vulnerable. Why? He became vulnerable for us. He left his Father's house so that he could be a blessing to us and to the whole world. He went out not knowing where he was going to go. He went into the abyss. I mean, you talk about homelessness. He experienced utter homelessness. You talk about fatherlessness. He experienced ultimate fatherlessness. And he did it so that he could pay the penalty for your sin and for mine. And he lost his father so that we could get his father. Right? He lost everything so that we could gain everything, so that we could be brought in to the family of God. And this is what Jesus is saying. It's very simple. He says, if you realize what I experienced, if you realize that in Jesus was the original and the ultimate call to leave his Father's house, to leave all security and embrace vulnerability so that we could have the security of knowing that we're adopted into the family of God, that we're loved by God, that we experience all joy and happiness in him, that it's then that we'll be able to step into our Abrahamic-esque callings. All right, it's what will empower us to step into the things that God is calling us into as well. We'll be able to surrender our will. We'll be able to handle any opposition. We'll be able to move out into the world and experience some of the alienation that comes with being a follower of God in a land that doesn't acknowledge or follow God. That we'll be able to weather the pressures of living in our city and in our culture, and yet not withdraw or pull ourselves out of it entirely. Like that's the key, that when you see the promise of God fulfilled in Jesus Christ for you, you'll have the confidence to respond as Abraham did. And again, what was Abraham's response? What did he do when he was given the call and the gift of a promise? We read verse 1, God said go. Verse 4, Abraham went. He did what one of my pastoral mentors would say is that Abraham did the next healthy thing. Even when he didn't know all the information, Abraham knew enough to do the next healthy thing. And so, what is that for you this morning, to do the next healthy thing? Like, forget New Year's resolutions for a moment, right? Like, I saw an article this past week that, the number one New Year's resolution was to save more money. Number 2 resolution was to lose weight. Number 3 was to spend more time with your kids, which is, great when you realize that, like, we'd rather be rich and skinny than, like, spend time with our family. So, like, forget your resolutions for a moment. Like, what's the next healthy thing that God is calling you to do right now? Like, what conversation do you need to have? Who do you need to be praying for that they might know Jesus? What community do you need to plug into? What is the next healthy thing that you ought to do but you've been putting off? Friend, today is the day. There's no better day, there's no better opportunity than this one to do the next healthy thing. And as we start doing the next healthy thing, as we trust Jesus in this moment, as we look ahead to the particular callings that he has on each of us, we can also ask this question too. Where can I most be a blessing? Where can I most be a blessing? You see, Abraham was called out in order to be a blessing. That's what God said. He says, I'm calling you to go to this place so that through you, all the families of the earth can be blessed. And so where might you most be a blessing? And did you know that this is the pattern throughout all of Scripture? This is how blessing only ever comes. You see, Jesus in his ministry in the Gospels would say that if you want to find your life, you have to give it up. Right? If you actually try to gain the whole world, you're going to lose your soul. So the only way that you are filled up is if you empty yourself. Or the only way that you can be a blessing is that if you're a blessing for others. If you're not so concerned about your own good, but your neighbor's good. You see, God says if you want to be blessed, if you seek to be blessed, or if you try to take from the world, you'll be empty. If you seek to bless others, I will bless you. If you live for the blessings of others, if you live to fill others up, God says, I'll fill you up. And so I think it means for us, we should be asking the question, how can I be a blessing? Right? Like if I'm not looking so much out for my own good or my own needs, but the needs of others, how can I be a blessing to other people? So what does it look like to get out of your country? What does it look like to get out of your family, your father's home? What does it look like to get out of your comfort zone, your space of security and safety? It might mean to get out of the familiar. It might mean to pick up practices like prayer, like spending time with God and things like that. It might look vastly different, but friends, can we be a community that commits to that this year of stepping out of our comfort, stepping out of our safety schemes and our places of security for the sake of others? I believe we can. I truly believe we can do it, and I'm excited to see what God does through that this year, because we can't do any more than what Jesus has done for us. Charles Wesley wrote a hymn that has a verse that says this. He says, "He left his Father's throne above, so free, so infinite his grace. He emptied himself of all but love and bled for Adam's helpless race." And because of what Jesus has done for us, friends, we too can move out into the world confidently trusting his promises so that we can be a blessing to those around us. Would you pray with me? Heavenly Father, we thank you that you are a God who came to us. Lord, the reminder of Christmas on this 12th day of Christmas, that you came to be with us, that you left your father's house. You embraced the unknown. You embraced vulnerability for our sake so that we might experience the blessing that comes with knowing you, the blessing that comes with having our sins forgiven full and free at the cross. And so, Lord, having experienced and beheld your example, your love, Lord, would you empower our church this year to go out, to obey the call in all the million ways that you have called us to go, but fundamentally, Lord, heeding the call to trust you, to know that you're good, and that because of your Son Jesus, we go with the promise that you are with us even to the end of the age. We ask all this in Christ's perfect and strong name. Amen.